See this? I'm going to get ready to do a backstreet number here in just a second. So, yeah, wait for it. No, this will help just with the recording, so we're not getting all the background sound and all that business. So that's why I have it on. But tonight we're going to kind of keep going with this DNA series. We were gone last week. Hopefully you guys were loving on the dads in your life. And we were at 1 Peter 4 before that, the week before that. And we were really looking at what does it mean to prepare ourselves to build this church, to plan for this church. And primarily, how do our prayers and our actions drive ourselves towards worship and other people towards worship. And so today we're actually going to look at kind of how does the church corporately do that. And we're going to, so if you remember this, maybe you read this in the Blue Book, they talk about the church as an organism and an organization. So that last week we were talking about that organism level, we as individuals being the church and living out those individual actions and aspects to be the church to the people around us. Today we're going to look at, and for the next several weeks, more the church corporate. How does this look? How do we act as an organization in unison together? And so that's going to be what we're going to do. And the other side of this is we're going to look at that diagram that you may remember from those vision meetings in the very beginning. And so for many of you, it's probably been a long time, so we're going to revisit those, but we're going to do it slowly, week by week. And if you haven't seen those yet, you're going to see it here for the first time. For everybody else, it's going to be kind of a revisit to what we're all about. And we're going to look at how this vision or this strategy, this diagram, relates to how the church has been doing this for thousands of years right now. And so we're going to start with Acts 2:42, and you guys probably are pretty familiar with that passage, and there's a good reason why. But before we get going, I want to pray. So pray with me. God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for this community. We thank you for the way that you continue to pour your love and grace out on us. And even when it becomes more and more difficult to meet with just the situations in our country and globally, that you allow this and allow us to do this and allow cool ways to do technology to help the rest of our friends that can't be here tonight. And God, we just thank you to be able to dive into your word, to be able to be taught by your Holy Spirit. And God, we ask that your word would direct not only our vision, but our actions in the upcoming weeks and years ahead as Converge Community. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'm going to start, like I said, with Acts 2:42 and read that for you all. And like I said, you also are probably pretty familiar. It's a paragraph or a passage that the church goes to often, the capital C church, and has for a long time. And there's a good reason for that. It says, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with the awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. And the reason this passage has been shared over and over and over in churches is because it's fueled churches, it's fueled the mission, and really a tangible vision of how the church should look and has looked for a long time. And that's why I go to it again today, why I go to it again today. And what I love about this is we constantly are talking about this, and I hope you hear me say it so much you can't stop thinking about it, but the up, in, and out aspect of the church, the capital C church. And I love this passage because you can see very explicitly the different parts that up in and out in this passage. I mean, right away, you see them talking about devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching. You see them breaking bread, which is kind of the sacrament of communion, of the Lord's Supper, and to prayer. At the end, you see they were glad, had sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. You see that a big part of this community was actually worship and spending time together worshiping God, that corporate time together, making sure their praises and their prayers went to God. We also see that out aspect in here. In the beginning, you see that the the mention of the miracles performed. And what's interesting is sometimes we think about that as much as more of because it's so driven by God as maybe like a worship thing, or maybe even because we're taking care of people. But really, when you see throughout Acts, the miracles almost always preceded evangelism. It was a visible, tangible way for people far from Jesus to actually have proof that Jesus was Lord, that the apostles, his people, served the one true God. And so when we see miracles wrapped into this, this isn't like an up thing or an in thing, although it could be. This is very much an out thing when they talk about this, because this was actually the inroad into the gospel for most people when they heard it in that day. But then obviously at the end, you see the explicit mentioning of how the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved, and even that all people enjoyed the favor of them, not just the fellowship of believers, but all people around them enjoyed the favor of these Christians. We see this intense out aspect of the faith. And then obviously there's an in aspect here in the way they met together, they gathered together daily. It says they ate together, they broke bread together, they did all these things together. And you get, even in a little bit we're going to see, is their sacrificial caring for each other as well. And this part of this, what you see in this is really a microcosm of the entire book of Acts, this short passage. And you see throughout the book of Acts these types of things repeated over and over and over, these up, in and out aspects. In fact, even in the first 2 chapters of Acts, if you look at them, the very first chapter, they're praying together. They're doing this upward worship. They're praying together, and this is where they get basically the direction, the wisdom to pick the 12th apostle. And then they cast lots and do all that business. That was a very upward moment. Acts chapter 2, right before the Pentecost, right before the Holy Spirit comes, they were in a room together praying together. This is all fueled by this worship and this togetherness in worship constantly. We see also this out aspect lived out over and over and over in Acts. I mean, that's what the book of Acts is. It's them building the church. It's them going out, taking it to where they haven't seen it before. And we see throughout even the first chapters of them going and ministering to their fellow Jews, their neighbors right around them. And you see as Acts goes on, they continue to go out further and further and further to Turkey and Greece and beyond to share the gospel. And what I love is we see this laid out in Acts. Acts 1:8 says, Jesus commands them to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and all the ends of the earth. We see this center outward movement. And if you look through Acts, you see them starting at Jerusalem and quite literally moving out. And it's actually a cool thing to do, to start tracking them geographically and see how that works. But we see obviously this inward care for the fellowship of believers throughout this. But one of the things that I want to point out to you is when they choose the 12th apostle in Acts 1, and then Acts 4, I think it's 4, when they choose the deacons, Acts 6, when they choose the deacons, this was actually to care for the fellowship of believers, right? They wanted the 12th apostle to add more leadership to help lead the new church. They chose the deacons in order to help make sure people were cared for, fed, and all that was going on. So this organizational leadership they were putting together was actually for the caring of the believers, this inward care. The other thing I want to point out too is we're just kind of scanning in those first handful of chapters here, because there's a lot more examples I could give you, is Acts 5, which is kind of a disturbing chapter for a lot of people, me included, is Ananias and Sapphira. And some of you may know the story. They were all selling their possessions, caring for each other, and Ananias and Sapphira basically lied about what they were doing and didn't give everything that they said they were going to give, or didn't account for how much they actually sold it for. And Peter knew them well enough that he was actually able to call them out. And what I love about this is actually an inward care part. And there's a really bad ending here. And so I'm not making any threats here. But what I want to say is what I love about this, it shows the inward care of the church, because Peter first knew them well enough to knew that something was awry, and he knew them well enough to call them out. And I think often the church is not doing everything it could when we don't know our people well enough to know what's going on in their life and either hold them accountable to something or just flat out know what they need and encourage them. And so I love that picture here. Again, that one kind of ends in a dark kind of way, but it certainly shows that part of the inward care of the church is also this high call, challenge, and accountability, and that's what we have to continue to live out. So I kind of walk through this saying, all right, how will Converge do this well? How are we going to live out this up together? And so part of that living out the up together is doing this stuff right now, these launch team meetings. This is awesome. I love doing this. We don't have music at these all the time. I mean, we have summer hits of the 90s usually, which is close to praise music, but that's the music. The praise music is coming, and so we actually have one July 26th, last Sunday in July. We're going to do a worship night here. We've got another one planned August 30th, and so we're going to do some of that. But what I want to focus on here is that what you see happening early on in Acts especially is you don't see worship services happening. Can you actually think of a worship service that happens in the book of Acts? And so I'm not saying worship services are bad, and I'm not saying they weren't having them. What I am saying, the most important thing we can do and continue to do as Converge Community is praying together and quite frankly, listening and teaching to each other. And so we're going to actually lean into this a little bit more. I want to make sure prayer continues to be the foundation of everything we do. We kind of stopped doing the online prayer things. We're going to start meeting and doing prayer before these. So we'll start doing prayer from 4 to 4:30 on these nights, on Sunday nights when we gather. So if you want to come, you can do that. But also, as we break out into these ministry areas later today, we're not going to have a prayer ministry because every ministry is a prayer ministry, and we want every one of these to be praying together. So prayer is going to be a big deal. The other piece of this is you see this teaching aspect is a really big deal in Acts. They teach to people inside of the church and people outside of the church. And if you remember when we talked about the worship night in February, the church in Antioch, there was lots of people that taught. It wasn't just the apostles. And so I'm really passionate about that too, because I want to encourage each of you to step into that and flex that teaching muscle. And in fact, our church planning residents are going to be teaching this summer, and they've got something fun cooking for you this week as well. But I want to actually extend that invitation out to all of you and actually go ask God, are you calling me to teach at some point at Converge? Because I hope he says yes, because I'm going to find a spot for her when he does. I think this is a really big deal. I think the other side of this is when these moments come up so when you look at Peter's first two sermons, they were not planned. He was doing something else. There was some kind of situational factor that happened, and Peter rose to the moment and ended up being one of these great sermons. Now, I'm not saying that's a pretty high bar to set for any of us, but what I am saying is there's going to be lots of moments right here in these environments, or maybe in your workplace or whatever, that I want you guys to practice that teaching, that proclamation muscle a little bit and be aware and listen. And when those moments come and you feel the Holy Spirit telling you to teach or instruct or proclaim something about the gospel, I actually want you guys to practice doing that a little bit. So even if we're teaching and I kind of wrap up and you say, hey, I feel like God's telling me I need to I'm going to listen to that. I really will. And I trust you guys are listening diligently to what the Lord wants you to say too. And so these are some of the ways that we're going to practice living into this up as a community right here. And we are going to get into worship services. And so my hope is August 30th, and we're going to talk more about calendar here at the end. My hope is that August 30th, we're actually able to do a preview service, which would be pretty cool, that you could invite friends to and that sort of thing. That also means we need a building by then, so that's cool. We're working on that. But we are going to get into that routine, and then in a perfect world, by October, I would love to see us going every other week in some kind of a worship service. And so we'll get more on that. So that's kind of what the up looks like. But my big My big reason or hope for us not doing worship services all the time right now is because, one, I want us to be all about the mission, first and foremost. But two, I think sometimes when we've come from church environments, and most of us have, when we come from church environments, that worship time becomes a little more self-centered than it should be. And I really want to use this season to starve us a little bit from that, from what we quote-unquote need, to say, what if worship is actually what it was supposed to be about worshiping God, first and foremost? And hopefully he blesses us when we're in worship and glorifying him, and maybe we get some peace or a word or something. That's great, but that isn't and shouldn't be our primary motivation for worship. So anyways, how will Converge live out the out? Well, we've hopefully been doing that pretty well, and even now, as we're starting to dabble back into going out and having relationships with people back in the real world, I want to continue to encourage you guys to do that, especially as it tends to be smaller groups now, or maybe outdoors, to continue to really reach in and take advantage of the time you have with them right now. Now, granted, a lot of people are probably already doing summer busy crazy, but I think it's a really good opportunity. I'm going to keep saying this again too, is that I think we're in this unique season where people are actually hungry to connect right now, and if we miss that, we're going to miss them. And so take advantage right now because people are hungry, and go start hanging out with people. Continue to do that. But one of the ways that we're going to do that is, so we got this diagram here, and some of you guys remember it. This big center circle is what we just talked about, right? Worship. And you guys are testing me right now, trying to write in a funny way here. So this is what we just talked about, how we live out worship. Obviously, there's an individual way we do worship, and I've been trying to challenge you guys in that, doing church at home, those kind of things, leading your families. So this, what I'm talking about here, is more that corporate organizational worship, and that's the stuff we all just talked about. How I hope we continue to live out this out on a corporate level. Again, I want you guys living out the out on an individual, on an organized organism level, is we have these big crowds. You guys remember this language? Or they could be small crowds. I'm going to put a little small one there too. All right, they're probably going to need to be small ones if we're really honest right now. And how I hope we're doing that is that we're actually getting 1 or 2 or 3 people from this place, from Converge, and you start hanging out pretty regularly with the same group of people. And so a great example of this is, the Keels aren't here tonight, but he's been doing that fishing night on Tuesday nights. It's both a few people from inside. I know Jared's part of it. Josh has been doing it. People from inside our church community, and a lot of people from outside. And the cool thing about it is it's a pretty consistent group. And so people are getting to know each other in a fun, pretty safe way. Like safe, they're not worried you're going to like beat them in the head with a Bible or something safe. And they're consistent meeting. And what I'm saying is those are functioning as a crowd. You're getting a small group of Converge people with a larger group of people who aren't, and you just start spending time together, developing relationships together. And then over time, their one connection to this church now has become 2 or 3 or 4, and they're going to be way more apt to listen to what you have to say or their friend has to say when all of a sudden they see a few people that don't seem like crazy church people to them. And so that's how the crowds, I hope, work. And these people, you remember all these circles? These people come from out here. And actually, Carter's going to talk about circles in a few weeks. These are all these little pockets of people that you know that you're bringing in to these crowds. So these are people from work. These are people from, I'm trying to think of examples because nobody does anything together anymore. From the brewery, from wherever, that you just start knowing, hanging them out, and you invite them into these crowd gatherings, and it becomes that consistent basis. And this, for us, is that Jerusalem sphere, right? Like God might call you to go outside of that and call you to reach out to a people group that is just so different culturally, it seems scary, or even so distant, maybe calls you to be a missionary at some point. But where we're targeting right now, because I don't think we do a good job even at the Jerusalem sphere, we're targeting the Jerusalem sphere of people in our lives right now. Who are those people very, very close to us, and how can we get them involved in the things that we're already doing? So last Friday we did that cornhole tournament, and that was the hope of that. Obviously, I hope you guys are doing that stuff on your own, one-on-one with friends. But those are kind of those moments where you have 3-4 Converge people and you can invite outside people, say, hey, come and hang out with us. This will be fun. We're just going to play cornhole and hang out in the backyard, you know. And where they work best, quite frankly, is if we have a lot. Where I'm showing 5 here, but realistically there should be 5 for a group this size. Because as you know, it's a lot easier to invite a friend to your backyard than it is to my backyard. And so in a perfect world, you're creating a lot of these smaller events where your friends feel safe coming into, and maybe you have a couple people from here join you. And so, a great place to start with that would be your huddles. I've been hanging out with Rick and John and Eric's huddle for the last couple months. And John says, he's like, man, we should be doing something on mission together as a huddle. I just like, this is great, right? And that's really a great place to start because you have your 3 or your 4 right there, and you start doing charade, doing the paddleboard thing. Like that is a great place to start to get that small number of Converge folks and getting outside people come in. Maybe it's just a group that you're just automatically connected with. I know like the Keels and the Stoffers hang out quite a bit. Like that's just a natural place to start. So that's how I see this happening, is building up those crowds, and so that we can continue to move people out. And again, this is on an organized level. Hopefully you're doing this all the time as an individual. Then finally, this in, how do we live this out? I think the primary place we're living out the in is in these huddles right here, right? These are all these 2 to 3 person groups. Remember, we can have some on the edges here. Hopefully you're bringing some people in that aren't a part of the church into these huddles. And again, the primary goal of these is accountability and transformation. They're a little bit different than a small group, because a small group tends often to be a bit more social, because the only time you ever do anything with them is at small group. These, hopefully you're hanging out with them fairly consistently outside of huddle. And then when you get to huddle, that's really the place where you drive accountability and transformation and can push the accelerator a little bit, challenge each other spiritually. This is those Ananias and Sapphira moments where you call them to the table and say, hey, you said you were going to do that. You're deceiving yourself. Why aren't you, right? Or it's the other moments where Barnabas comes along Paul and can just encourage him and love him and be nice and say, man, you shouldn't be so mean to Mark. You know, like those are the kinds of things that I think the huddle actually allow us to do really well. And at the end of the day, I want that to be the primary source where we're actually getting discipled and discipling others. It would be great if I could do that for all of you, but let's be honest, I just can't. I can't disciple you like a group of 2 or 3 people together can be by each other. And so I want to encourage you guys to keep leaning into the huddles, keep making that a priority in everything you do. And even Kenzie and I were just talking about this morning, like it would be really scary to be Converge Community in a COVID environment when it's hard to get everybody together right now if we didn't have huddles. And I didn't know that people are really doing awesome, taking big steps in these, but the reality is they are. And so that's great. And we have this collective unity that we live out in those huddles, getting discipled together. But then part of that too is discipling others. And we have been talking a little bit in huddles about how do we shift gears from being discipled and actually think about when we're leading a huddle or start discipling others. And what I want to encourage you with is sometimes we maybe over-spiritualize what discipleship is. And I don't want to sound irreverent here, but discipleship isn't just sharing the 4 laws. Discipleship isn't just inviting them to a Bible study. Discipleship isn't just getting them to come to listen to your pastor. Discipleship is actually just doing this life-on-life stuff, just helping them walk through this life as best they can. And what I mean by that is saying, Jesus wants them to live out everything they can be, everything he created them to be. And if you're helping them do that, Christian or not, that is discipleship. So I was in a huddle a couple weeks ago, and with Matt and Lance O'Green, who's in there, and Kyle's in there, and but Lance was sharing about this guy who's at work with, and he's just like a younger kid, and he's the manager, and he's just couldn't get anything out of him. He's kind of not very dependable in the beginning, and he's just like, I don't know what to do with him. He was really at an impasse, and we just kind of landed the spot. Like, I think we have to pray. Like, there's nothing else we can do. Lance felt like he's tried everything to try to get through and open up a relationship with this kid. And so that's what we did. And then the next week, I think it was, or maybe 2 weeks later, I can't remember, Lance kind of reported, he's like, man, this kid actually opened up to me this week and just started talking about, these are the types of, he's a high school student, these are the types of jobs I want. And Lance is like, man, I know somebody in every one of those industries. I'm going to try to get him connected with those people to help him along. That's discipleship. That really is. They're just trying to help this kid who, I don't know where he's at spiritually, but may not know Jesus, become the person that Jesus wants him to become, everything. And when you start helping them with those types of things, and you start building the trust like that, all of a sudden the door opens a little bit more for maybe a deeper spiritual conversation. That's what we continue to push for, is those next level conversations. It might be emotional. It might be something more personal. It might be health related. We're trying to get them to start having a conversation that shows, I trust you, I'm letting you in. And eventually, maybe, just maybe, they'll trust you enough to actually have that spiritual conversation with them, and you have enough credibility, you have enough equity, relational equity, where they say, okay, I want to know what you think about this whole religion thing, and you can have that conversation. But that's what I want you guys to realize. Discipleship is spiritual, don't get me wrong, but I don't want you to over-spiritualize it, and I don't want you to think you have to be an expert in the Bible to disciple somebody well. These books, these blue books, are tools to help you get the conversation started when they're ready, but most of discipleship happens just through that life-on-life stuff, like what Lance had with this employee. So that's going to be a lot of that, how we're going to live this out, how we're going to care for each other, how we're going to disciple. And this is really, this diagram, we're going to keep revisiting it every week. And this week, we're going to kind of land right in here on this worship space. And my hope is that we get some movement on what that looks like as a community. But what I want to do is I want to give you this disclaimer here, is that often we as church people, busy church people, think, well, as long as I'm in like doing one of those, or maybe two, like, I got this. I'm doing pretty good Christian. And I want to push back on that a little bit to say, actually, what Jesus has called us into, he's called us into living out, both as individuals and as the organized church, to be in every one of these spheres. And when I say every one of these spheres, these are people from every one of these spheres. Called us to be a participant, a leader in this worship part. Called us to be a leader participant in this outward mission. Called us to be a leader participant in these huddles where discipleship is happening. And so when we're going to do this worship circle in here today, and I say that because I don't want is people think, okay, I'm going to help out with worship, or I'm going to help out with greeting, and then I'm good. Then I don't have to do the mission stuff. I don't have to do the huddle. I say no to that, right? I know there's going to be times in your life when you're busy and you might have to step back for a hot second, and that's okay. Boundaries are good. Personal health, spiritual health, mental health is good. But in general, Jesus has called us to engage this up in and out all the time, both individual and corporately. And we see that lived out over and over and over again in Acts. So I want to push on you guys to say, especially as launch team members, as Converge Community founders, how can I be involved in every one of these layers? And so one of them you're probably already doing, right? You're doing the huddles. Most of you are doing the huddles. That's one of those layers. You're already doing it. Hopefully you'll be leading one of those soon when you're ready to do that. The crowds is something we're going to lean into, say, what are you doing on an organized way to get people involved? But today, I want to kind of push you guys to say, what will you do? What will your time look like serving Converge Community for our worship services, for our worship nights? And so I'm going to actually break you guys up into 4 groups. And I want you guys to pick. I sent out that ministry interest form. And notice like those were kind of Sunday morning centric. There's a lot of other good ways to get involved. We're just not talking about those right now. We will eventually. So I want you guys to figure out where you think that primary place you're going to land, and then you're going to meet together as a group and start planning and dreaming and getting to know each other, sharing not only your experiences, but your hopes and goals as an individual, but also for the church. And so if you're interested kind of in the worship arena, so teaching, music, tech, you're going to go with Carter. If you're interested in kind of the hospitality sector, so connections, greeting, like coffee, food, kind of that hospitality piece, you're going to go with Sarah. And if you're interested in the parking, safety, security kind of stuff, you're going to go with Josh. And if you're interested in caring for our wonderful kids and starting that kids ministry, which is a big job, don't get me wrong. And another disclaimer here, being a part of a church plant, we have free orange for like 3 years. So we're not asking you to write curriculum. Don't let that scare you away from doing kids ministry. Now, if you really love that, I might consider letting you, but I know it's a lot of work. So that's why I said might. But I just want to put that out there because I don't want you to run from kids ministry because you think it might be that. But those are kind of the 4 areas. That's going to be with Kenzie, the kids. And then, like I said, with prayer, we're going to do prayer. It's going to be in everything, always part of every ministry we have. And I love how the bridge actually meets together before, like an hour before the worship service and praise. I love that motto. We'll probably do that as well. But yeah, so you're going to take this time to break up. You're going to have about 20 minutes to just kind of talk, connect, get some ideas going. Those facilitators are going to kind of write down notes on their phone or paper or whatever. And then we'll come back. And when we come back, I'm going to give you a quick update on where we're at with the calendar, where we're at with the buildings, and that sort of thing. And so right now you're thinking, how do we plan for these things if we don't know where or when we're going to be in a building? And the partial answer to that is, yeah, you can't plan all that well. But there are bigger philosophical chunks that you guys can start working on long before we have a building, because all the unknowns about getting into a space right now, we're not even quite sure what the COVID thing's going to do either, which could change things as well. So we're going to kind of just keep putting one foot in front of the other and do that. And I'm going to ask and encourage you guys to just start planning more big picture. We will be in a space that will be important, and regardless of the space, how we do that, what are some big things. So go ahead, break up now, and then I'll come back in about 20 minutes and kind of give you the update, and that'll be it for the night.